You are now listening to Redbeard Talks Redbirds, your home for all things Cardinals baseball. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Redbeard Talks Redbirds. I am Alex Stovall, and we talk all things Cardinals baseball and the MLB. And we have a very special episode here. We've got a New York Times best-selling author, Keith O'Brien, got a brand new book out, Charlie Hustle. This is a biography on Pete Rose. And I just finished reading it, but I would love for you to tell us about it in your own words.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me, Alex. This is, I hope, the definitive story of Pete Rose's rise and fall, the whole thing, the good and the bad, capturing, how an ordinary man from an ordinary working class background, of frankly ordinary talents and athleticism, manages to scrape and claw his way to the mountaintop through hard work and of course, the famous hustle, but also a lot of lucky breaks. And then he loses it all. And mostly because of his own decisions and his own choices and his own addictions. I wanted to tell that story for two reasons. One, I feel like, in the past, too often Pete Rose's story has been looked at through the prism of baseball. I was just looking at it as the story of a man. And the second reason why I began working on this project, I guess almost 3 years ago now, is because the world had completely changed, and we see that
Yes.
now today with the sweeping legalization of gambling. And I want to be clear, as you know, and as your viewers and listeners know, any player who were to bet on baseball or his own games today would face the same punishment that Pete Rose faced in 1989. No one is arguing different. However, there is an embracing of gambling that simply wasn't happening a decade ago, and certainly no one could have foreseen coming 35 years ago. And I do think that this new world order, where gambling is legal in 38 states, is changing our culture, changing sports, and doing it in ways we might not even be cognizant of right now, but we'll see in a few years.
You're right. I agree with every bit of that. And then also throw in the fact that we're starting to pay college athletes and everything else. And there's just a whole lot that has to get figured out. And it's interesting what's going on right now. Um, so I love this book, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. You approach this as telling the story of a man. You weren't telling a baseball story, and I was surprised and impressed with the level of detail. And I've seen you talk with a few other people where you discuss, how much time and energy you spent researching this, and like I said, the level of detail you went into, it was impressive and it was interesting and all of those things. I guess I would want to ask you, um, what made you want to tell this story? I know that you grew up in Cincinnati, and so you got to view kind of maybe the second half of this story as you were kind of growing up a little bit.
Yeah. I'm born and raised in Cincinnati. I was born on the west side, just a couple miles from where Pete grew up. Ultimately, spent most of my childhood on the east side of Cincinnati. As you
Okay.
said, I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years, but I'm fully a fan of baseball and the Reds. When Pete is traded back in '84 from Montreal, I remember exactly where I was when he broke the all-time hit record in 1985. And I do remember what it felt like to watch him unravel in 1989. So, in that way, it's personal, and those feelings help inform my reporting. But, I've written this book in the same way I've written every other book. This is, narrative, nonfiction history, reported history. I'm not in the story, but I know the streets where Pete grew up. I know his high school. I went to school with guys like Pete Rose, and I know what it felt like as a Cincinnatian to watch him lose it all.
So, like you said, in a way, this is personal because you're telling some of your own story a little bit too.
Yeah, obviously I'm not in the book, as you know. It's not like it's not about me. You won't see, the word I or me in there at all.
Right.
But yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, let's just use the hit record as an example. September 1985, the night that Pete Rose sets the all-time hit record in Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. I remember exactly where I was standing. When I watched that moment, I was standing next to my father and my sister in our living room in Cincinnati. And I lived close enough to the ballpark that when they would shoot off fireworks, as they would in at that time, if someone hit a home run, you could hear them. And so, I remember watching the moment on TV, hearing the distant crackle of the fireworks that went off as it happened. And none of that's part of the book, but it informs the moment, and I think that's another thing,
Absolutely.
like uh, baseball assumed such a bigger piece of our consciousness in 1985 for all of us. This wasn't just a big deal in Cincinnati. This was a big deal in St. Louis. This was a big deal across America, when Pete Rose set the all-time hit record. If you were a baseball fan, if you were alive and watching in 1985,
Right.
you do know where you were.
Yeah. Yeah, I am a little bit young for that, but I'm maybe a little bit of a unicorn in that I consider myself a bit of a baseball purist, and I love the history of the game, and I love reading about it and learning about it. And so that was very enjoyable to kind of learn more about that since I didn't really get to experience it much. Um, so I think you kind of already answered this question, but like I said, you had a ton of detail in this book, and I was going to ask you how much time you spent researching, but I think you already told us 3 years and just
Almost three
tons of
years.
time. And I was looking through tons of notes inside the book as well.
Yeah, well, I feel again, just as a storyteller, as a historian, that it's important, to let a reader know, if he or she is interested, how I know something. Um,
Of course.
I don't want to like gum up my narrative, with a bunch of uh, you know uh, sources or footnotes or anything like that. But if you're curious about how I know a certain scene, it's in the back of the book. It is
It's
it is
all there.
noted.
I love that. So there was one thing that stuck out to me near the beginning of the book that piqued my interest, and I'd love to hear as much as you're willing to tell us. You mentioned very quickly and briefly in the book that Pete Rose met with you and talked with you, and then he talked with you until he stopped returning your calls. I would love to hear what was happening and maybe what caused that, in your opinion.
The short answer is I don't know. My Cincinnati roots undoubtedly helped open the door here, and got me the access to Pete Rose.
Okay.
And we did 27 hours of recorded interviews, both on the phone and then over the course of 3 days in Las Vegas, where he lives today. And then, I did spend a couple of days out on the road with Pete while he was doing signing shows or appearing, for paid appearances, say to christen a new casino, which is something I saw him do. Uh, and Everything was fine. We didn't have a falling out. There was no contentious conversation. Um, but I was pushing him, you know.
Sure. As I expect you have to in that situation.
Well, I explained to him that, in order for people to understand what happened, You have to, let folks into the darkness. You got to let people see that. And I
Yeah.
don't use darkness in like some kind of nefarious way. We all have our personal darknesses, our regrets, our sadness, our the things that weigh on us. We all have that. This
Yes.
does weigh on Pete Rose. I mean, it changes everything for him. And so we got to talk about it. And, I will say there's stuff in the book that, Pete's never talked about before, details he's never shared before. Uh, but I do think that perhaps maybe I pushed him as far as he could go.
Was it kind of chronological? Was there a point within his story where he got to the point where he didn't want to do anymore, or was it not necessarily directly chronological in that way?
Most of our interviews were chronological,
Okay.
um, which was how I would approach this book with anybody if I was, writing about their whole lives.
Yeah.
But it's not like we suddenly talked about gambling on the last day. Pete talked a lot about gambling,
Sure.
and again, based on my interviews with Pete and interviews with others. Uh, Pete was betting with bookies on sports like football and basketball as early as the early 1970s. So again, it's not like it just comes out of nowhere at the end and sinks him. He's sinking for years. He just doesn't know it.
Right. Well, most people in those positions probably are.
Well, that's a
Okay.
good point. And this is not part of the book. But there are real reasons why someone may not be honest about their gambling. In peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, again and again, there are two barriers for a gambling addict finding help. And the first is shame, and the second is indebtedness. And Pete would never admit to feeling shame. He can't be vulnerable like that. But I
Right.
can tell you without question that in the 1980s, he was in debt to bookies, and I do believe that indebtedness and his choices, was embarrassing to him, and it was not something he'd want to talk about. So, you know, it's easy to say, well, Pete lied and he shouldn't have lied, and all that's true. But like a lot of addicts, and many people, will have crossed paths with addicts in their own lives, in their own families. With a lot of addicts, it may have honestly been impossible for Pete to come clean in 1989, given what he was
Sure.
wrestling with at the time.
Well, all of our greatest competitors, let's just talk about professional athletes, they have to have A, the skill set, B, the personality traits or some type of trauma or something that is driving them the way it's driving them. And, you can't get to that high sustained level of success without that stuff, whatever it is, however you get it. And so, if that drives you as a human being for that long, how do you all of a sudden just turn that off? I don't think you can expect people to do that. Certainly not easily.
Yeah, I would agree with that in general. And on top of all that, Pete just liked to take things to extremes.
Yeah,
Everything. I interviewed one of his former mistresses, a woman who had a 2 or 3 year affair with him in the 1970s, and she said Pete liked to push the boundaries,
sure.
and he was certainly doing it with his gambling.
Yeah. So, I would love to get your thoughts on a situation that is unfolding before our very eyes, and we are very murky on the details. But Shohei Ohtani and all that situation is becoming interesting, and the story has changed a little bit. And it seems like there might be something weird going on there. What are your thoughts on that? And uh, there's obviously parallels between the story with Pete Rose, at least to some degree.
Well, as most folks know, Shohei has now spoken to the media in a prepared statement and, denied any involvement whatsoever with gambling, any dealings whatsoever with bookies, and has gone on the record that, whatever happened in Southern California with us, with an alleged legal bookie, and his interpreter, Shohei's interpreter, he's saying it didn't involve him.
Mm-hmm.
What I can say for sure is that we are just at the start of this.
Yeah.
Just like in 1989, a few things have led to this being, made public. Federal investigators are investigating an alleged bookie in Southern California. In the mid 1980s, federal investigators, in other words, the FBI, was investigating an alleged bookie and other men in dealing with all kinds of other stuff in Ohio. Just like today, it's the press who has broken the news. And in the 1980s, it was Sports Illustrated that gets the tip that Pete is betting on baseball. And both today and in 1989, there is now a Major League Baseball investigation that has been started. And, that investigation in 1989 took weeks, 8 to 10 weeks, 3 months to get a report and a gathered dossier of evidence about what baseball knew about Pete Rose. And then Pete Rose and his attorneys and Major League Baseball and its attorneys fought all summer in court over legal matters surrounding that evidence. So the whole thing takes 7 months to play out, from the early rumors to Pete's banishment. I'm not suggesting at all that that's where we're headed with Shohei Ohtani. As we said, he's denied any involvement. But I do think that if baseball is going to look into this in a serious way, that it's going to take, at a minimum, weeks. It could take longer.
Yeah. Oh, I would expect it to take a lot longer unless it's obvious that everything's clean, or maybe it's obvious that we just want this all to go away. Well, that's amazing and incredible and very interesting to see what happens. Well, I know you've got a jam-packed schedule. Thank you very much for taking the time. Why don't you tell everybody where we can find you, find your awesome, very thick, very well-researched new book?
Well, Charlie Hustle is available for sale wherever they sell books, wherever you buy books. You can follow me on Twitter at Keith OB, and I'm on Instagram at O'Brien Story.
I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope we get to do this again sometime.
Thanks for having me, Alex. My pleasure.
Thank you, Keith. Have a good one.
You too.
All right. Hey, y'all. Thank you so much once again for joining us for this episode of Redbeard Talks Redbirds podcast. Make sure you go over there, hit like and subscribe for this channel. And don't forget to hit that notification button. Make sure you don't miss the next episode. Let's go, Cardinals.